to support the community, specifically outside of the church walls, not just our church members. So we have the Emmanuel Lutheran Trust Fund, and I'm Christina Kolstad, the president of the trust fund at the moment. And we provide scholarships for local teens going into college. Yes, some of them come from the church, but we have outreach going to, this year, to foster kids going into secondary school of whatever that choice is. Saratoga High School kids can apply. We also do community grants to local summer camps, making sure that every kid gets to go to camp, to food, soup kitchens, all kinds of things. We are very happy that Paul's agreed to do this speech tonight. We've really enjoyed it in the past and are so happy to share it with you. And we're so grateful for the Saratoga Historical Museum for co-sponsoring it and really leading the effort to get so many people in the door. So I'd like to introduce Annette Stransky from the Saratoga Historical Museum, excuse me.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Great. So our mission is to preserve Saratoga's rich history for the generations to come. That's what the Saratoga History Museum does. We have a lovely museum, Pioneer Cottage, one room, schoolhouse, blacksmith, interurban passenger stop. Now, how many of you have been to the museum? Not bad, not bad. Could be better, but you know. Thank you very much. We're open 1 to 4 on Friday and Sunday and 10 to 4 on Saturday. We are all volunteer, and we have this very, very special exhibit on Paul Masson, famous vintner, as well as the Paul Masson champagne cellars, which everybody here probably remembers, because you're about that age, that the champagne cellars had this wonderful display of wine tasting. So usually you all kind of came on a weekend and had a good time. So I remember it. So we do have some great events coming up. We have the history of the Kaiser Permanente Quarry on April 23rd, 7 o'clock on Zoom, and it's with Ted Atlas. On April 24th, we have Arbor Day. That's at 3:30. And we're going to plant a Blenheim apricot. Yay. So that'll be very historic. On May 17th, we have the Blossom Festival. And Blossom Festival has all these wonderful bands, children's activities, petting zoo, antique cars, everything you can imagine and not imagine. And it's a great place to be from 10 to 4. That's May 17th. I want to thank the Emmanuel Lutheran folk. They've been so nice doing everything for us. Also, the Milpitas Historical Museum, the Sunnyvale Heritage Park Museum, and the Mountain View Historical Park for supporting tonight's program. So now I'm just going to say a little bit about Paul because you already know him. You probably know him better than me. But he has a BS in electrical engineering, an MS in material science from Stanford. He has spent decades as an engineer, executive, president, and educator. The man is smart. He's held several high-level positions in HP, Compaq, Tandem, and more. And he's also been in publishing quite a long time, too. So I want to introduce... Just turn myself off.
And I think I turned myself on. There we go. Well, welcome tonight. If you saw the little pre-video, you know that my purpose tonight is to make you understand how Silicon Valley got here, why it's here instead of in New Jersey or New York or someplace else, and help you understand what the secret sauce is. Clark will turn the volume up a little more for me. I'm nursing a little bit of laryngitis, so I'm going to be very careful tonight. Okay, so I'll start with an early story. The classic Silicon Valley startup started really with the Homebrew Computer Club, which was a bunch of hobbyists meeting in Menlo Park and then at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. And Steve Wozniak found out that for 20 bucks he could buy a 6502 microprocessor and use Motorola's peripheral chips and make a processor of his own. He had to, of course, design the operating system for it. We'll give it a try here. Maybe a little lower, I've got some feedback. So he and Steve Jobs started the company in a garage, which is how it's supposed to start, and built the Apple I mainly to sell to friends. And Steve Wozniak sold his HP 65 calculator, and Steve Jobs sold his VW van to get the money to do it. They were introduced to each other by a neighborhood friend, Bill Fernandez, who said, gee, Steve Jobs, you ought to meet Steve Wozniak. His dad works at Lockheed. He's an engineer. And this is what got it all started. So it's the classic story, partnership called Apple Computer, started in a garage, largest stock market capitalization, well, maybe NVIDIA, but a most valuable brand in the world. And how could that happen, and why did it happen in the San Francisco Bay Area? What was so special about having it here? Well, as the Saratoga Historical Museum will show you, we date back to a very early day of the Valley of the Heart's Delight. And this is what the fields looked like then, and this was our product. Prunes and apricots and peaches, things like that, cherries. And Senator Leland Stanford, back in 1880, said, someday you will see Palo Alto blooming with nearly all the flowers of the earth and the fruit and shade trees of every zone. In the future, we shall can this fruit and send it all over the globe in exchange for wealth, which we did. It was a big industry here, but eventually the technology overtook agriculture as our main product. So we're going to go back and look at an early company called Federal Telegraph. And it was formed in 1909 in Palo Alto by Cyril Elwell, who was a Stanford grad. And Lee DeForest came and worked there for a couple of years. He had designed the first and patented the first vacuum tube, the Audion, which I'm going to pass around. This one's from about 1914. And while Lee DeForest was here, he also patented the oscillator circuit and the amplifier circuit. So here in Palo Alto, we have this amazing amount of technology being developed already. I'm going to pass it down this side, then bring it up the other side. Well, Federal Telegraph was really our first company. He licensed the pulse and arc transmitter in 1909 and raised funds from what we would call angel investors today. David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford, and Charles Marks, the civil engineering professor, and John Casper Branner in geology, about $500 from each to get this thing off the ground. And they demonstrated communication from San Francisco to Honolulu and back again, so they could reliably talk by this new thing called radio across the Pacific Ocean to Hawaii. So here we have the first venture capital and the involvement of the University of Stanford helping their students. Well, by the 1920s, they had 3 high-power stations, one in Portland, one in San Francisco, and one in Los Angeles, and they covered most of the Pacific Ocean. So rather than selling radios, they sold a service. You could contact your steamship line, you could contact the steamships, and pass messages to them and back again. So for a nickel or a dime, they could get a message across. There's a plaque at the corner of Channing and Emerson commemorating this original company. Another of the entrepreneurs was Otis Moorhead, a Stanford engineering grad. Back in those days, they liked to make tubes, and he established Moorhead Laboratories in San Francisco to make vacuum tubes. But he didn't have any intellectual property, so he decided he would just bootleg them. So he was making them. If you make a couple of hundred, you can get away with it. But if you're making thousands, it could be a problem. So a patent infringement lawsuit put him out of business in the early 1920s. And this tube is one of the original Moorhead tubes. It says on it, licensed for amateur experimental use only, which wasn't enough of a disclaimer to avoid the patent suit. So I'll pass this one around also. That's about 1920. So some of the defining events, we'd had the gold rush, so we had a lot of money in our economy here. The importance of technology became pretty obvious. With the sinking of the Titanic, many of you remember that story about how the lack of communication caused a lot of people not to be rescued. And then in World War I, they discovered that this technology was very important. And the US Navy then pushed for ship-to-shore and other radio communication modes. Also, the economics was very good. Rather than having to run lines all across the country from Wichita to Omaha to Dallas, you could just use radio to hop over that distance, a lot less maintenance that way. Also underwater, instead of running cables, if you could use radio, this would be a nice advantage because you don't have to then go underwater to repair these cables. And this brought a lot of activity and a lot of funding to the Bay Area. So for this story, we're going to follow three early pioneers, Bill Eitel, Jack McCullough, and Charlie Litton. And they were all Bay Area kids, raised here, born here. Charlie Litton, I show him here, it says on the outside of this door in his backyard, it says wireless house. And here he is at 11 years old, experimenting in 1918, 1920 with this wireless technology. Well, Bill Eitel took shop classes over at Los Gatos High School, and he worked in his father's quarry up above Saratoga, up in the hills, assisting as a blacksmith and a machine operator. And during the summer in his high school years, he worked at his uncle's company, the Hall Scott Motor Car Company, running complex machinery. So he was a high school kid. He's got his hands into the technology. And Jack McCullough and Charlie Litton went to the California School of Mechanical Arts, which is known today as Lick Wilmerding High School. But it was funded by James Lick to give a good education to people who like to work with their hands, boys and girls who were mechanically oriented and liked shop and building things. And Litton said he gained a realistic feel of materials and processes during those high school years at the California School of Mechanical Arts. Well, McCullough then went on to a junior college, whereas Litton enrolled in the mechanical engineering program at this young university called Stanford. And Stanford had a very practical flavor. When the Stanfords founded the university, they wanted it to be for the children of California, to make them become productive citizens for the state. So it was a hands-on college without the Ivy League kind of look to it. Litton got his bachelor's in mechanical engineering in 1924, and in 1925 he took Stanford's first communication engineering fundamentals class taught by Frederick Terman. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a few minutes. Well, all of these fellows were introduced to amateur radio, what we call ham radio, through their families and friends. How many of you are ham radio operators? So we've got N6XI, okay, quite a few here. This is rather unusual for an audience. Usually there's one, maybe two. That's good. At any rate, ham radio in the Bay Area was kind of unusual. The Bay Area was quite isolated, but it was a major seaport on the West Coast. And the shipping companies needed radio operators as radio got going in the teens and 20s. And by the time they started licensing them in about the early 1920s, there were about 1,200 ham operators in the Bay Area, which was about 10% of the national population of hams. Today, our statisticians would call that a bubble, but they didn't recognize that at the time. But something was happening here. So this was also an active area of radio production here. Magnavox, you recognize that from the speakers that they made. They were started up in the Napa Valley and moved to Oakland, Jensen. Heinz and Kaufman designed really nice, what we call HF radio. Federal Telegraph I mentioned, and by 1920 they had 1,000,000-watt transmitters. I'll give you a picture of those in a little while. But the nice thing for the hobbyists was there were parts available because there were companies making things. So if you were a hobbyist in this, you might be able to get some free parts, certainly some advice. And as I said earlier, there are jobs for people who liked radio, wanted to be into radio, and knew something about it. The subculture of ham radio is kind of interesting. It's very sociable. We like to talk over the air to people, and in person. We get together in ham fests and meetings and get to know each other. And so we do communicate face-to-face also, although for nerds like me, it's much easier to look at my shoes than to talk to somebody. So I'd rather do it over the air or over the internet these days. But anyway, but it's a very egalitarian and democratic society. Not much distinction for class or education. For example, when Bill Eitel chaired the Santa Clara County Radio Club, he said it had farm boys, Stanford students, Federal Telegraph technicians, and retired executives, all working together on this hobby, much as you heard about for the Homebrew Computer Club up in Menlo Park. So mainly, in those days especially, the interest was in extending the technology. So you got your personal reputation by doing something better or improving something, having a better directional antenna, or talking to somebody in Topeka, Kansas, which was farther than the other guy who only talked to Utah. So there's a lot of competition there of trying to be better, and then once you do it, the ethos in ham radio is you help other people do it. So you show them what you did, help them do it. As I mentioned, Steve Wozniak, the main thing he wanted to do when he designed the Apple I computer was give the schematics and so on to everybody. He didn't patent any of that. He just wanted his friends to build one and use his operating system. So it's a lot like what they did in the Homebrew Computer Club and a lot like today's Silicon Valley. If Steve Jobs needed some advice, he called up Bill Hewlett at Hewlett Packard and says, Bill, how do you run these companies? And Bill's happy to help him. So this is more typical than untypical. I mentioned Frederick Terman. He was another young pioneer. His father, for health reasons, moved to San Bernardino, California, and became principal of the high school where actually I graduated from, many years after he was there, of course. And then he got hired by the Los Angeles Normal School, which today we call UCLA. And then Stanford hired him away a couple of years later into their education department. So young Fred Terman comes to the Stanford campus at about 10 years old in 1910. Herbert Hoover, one of the very early graduates of Stanford, had made a lot of money in Australia and China as a mining engineer and consultant. And he moved back to the campus and rented a house across the street from the Termans. So we have Herbert Hoover Jr., I can say that, and Roland Marx, the son of the civil engineering professor, and George Branner and Jack Franklin, the son of the chemistry professor, all working together, these 12 to 16-year-old kids working on this hobby called radio. And Herbert Hoover Jr. said, all three of us were neighbors, and upon pushing the key of one of our imposing contraptions, would holler out the window to see if it had been received on the other side of the street. So they're building these radios. You can see Herbert Hoover Jr. here in 1923 with his ham radio set up. And here he is when he was the president of the Radio Association in America. Well, young Fred Terman says if you saw a 90-foot pole sticking up somewhere, you'd go and knock on the door and get acquainted with him, because obviously it's a radio guy and you can maybe run his equipment or get some parts or learn something from him. So people on their bikes went around the neighborhood looking for people working with radio. And Terman hung out at Federal Telegraph, which was just a few blocks, maybe half a mile down El Camino. And then he worked there one summer in high school. So he had some good experience. Here he is at 17 years old at his ham radio outfit. So we're going to follow these amateurs, these hobbyists. Eitel, Litton, and McCullough were all ham friends, and they were experimenting with vacuum tubes, which were pretty new in those days. They built their own parts and equipment. I can remember as a boy getting an old oatmeal container, the round ones, and winding an antenna, or winding an inductor for tuning my antenna. And they made some notable contributions in those days. In 1924, Lytton, with the Stanford Radio Club, made the first radio contact across the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand. And in 1928, ITEL pioneered what we call the 10-meter band, 30 megahertz band, for communication across the continent. Fairly new stuff, pioneering things. Well, Lytton got a job through a local ham friend at Federal Telegraph, and it had built up to about 60 engineers. It was in this building on Emerson Street in Palo Alto, and during the years when Lee DeForest was there, he had this building on the left with two of his technicians, and that's where he did his development work. Eitel got a job through a ham friend at Heinz and Kaufman, the other company I mentioned that made HF radios. And Heinz was also a ham, so they had that community among themselves. They recruited McCullough about a year later to join them. Well, the tube business in those days, this is an interesting thing. The tube business was pretty much dominated by East Coast companies, General Electric, Westinghouse, AT&T, and so on. And they developed high-power transmitting tubes in the early 1920s. And they're difficult to produce, they're touchy, it's hard to make reliable ones, to machine them correctly, blow the glass, get them sealed so they don't leak. It's a rather challenging operation, so they weren't all that reliable. You might get 3 months out of them, maybe a year. But the problem for our people was you couldn't buy them on the open market. The Navy and General Electric set up a new company called Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, to make sure the US dominated the technology. And they would only, they took the licenses of all of the US companies and the European companies, and they had exclusive cross-licensing of key patents only with their licensees. Well, our companies were selling equipment to international telephone and telegraph. So it was going into Spain and China and different places. So these companies would not sell these new tubes to Heinz and Kaufman and so on. So both companies needed to develop their own triode tubes. So Lytton headed up one of the tube shops, and ITEL headed up the other one, and they have to develop these tubes. But I want to point out, part of the title is why Silicon Valley started here, and that's the reason, is to break patents and try to do something better because they were locked out by a monopoly. So there's, when the quiz at the end, that's the answer to that question. So the tube shop's challenges were to design around, especially about 250 key patents, which was pretty difficult. So they hired a lot of local people, many of which had radio experience. ITEL and Lytton, at two different companies, collaborated with each other, which is novel. If you're at IBM on the East Coast, you don't talk to Raytheon or Univac or other companies. You keep it in your company. Out here, we're small little companies, as I'll mention later. We need to have those small informal partnerships. And this was based upon their friendships over the years and working together and their trust. But they also work closely with patent attorneys, first of all, to make sure they don't infringe a patent, and secondly, to patent any new developments. For example, they developed new molybdenum plates, which weren't in the RCA patent. So they were able to patent a lot of new technologies and geometries so that they got a good patent pool. So Heitz, ITEL, and McCullough engineered a rugged new power tube with new materials and new manufacturing methods. They had new shock-resistant seals, so they were much more reliable. Charlie Lytton invented the oil vacuum pump, which gave them much higher vacuums and better reliability. And I'll talk a little bit more about his ability to help seal them. But anyway, they were reliable and longer life than the RCA tubes. But the main thing was they didn't infringe RCA patents. So like Moorhead, unlike Moorhead, they didn't have to shut down and stop making them. Lytton in his lab, invented the glass lathe. How many of you have run a lathe to make table legs or lamps or things? So I had one in my garage when I was 10 to 12 years old. Just look at all my fingers. So he adapted the lathe so that he had a single axis of operation. He could put the Pyrex glass on there, blow it, build the stuff in there, and seal it all on one axis. High precision, much better tubes, very repeatable and reliable. And he did it on his parents' property in a shed in the back, so we sort of grandfather him into doing it in the garage. Then comes the Depression in 1929, 1930. Eitel and McCullough leave to form their own company, iMac, so us hams know iMac real well. With financing, they got some from Harrison, who was a real estate agent in San Bruno, and another $20,000 from Preddy, who had movie theaters in San Francisco. So they each put up $20,000. Eitel and McCullough brought the know-how, and they shared the property 50%, the company 50%. So Eitel and McCullough got half the value of the company, and the investors got the other half. And so that's a precursor to what we think of today as venture capital, as we'd see out in Menlo Park's Sand Hill Road. So this is the first example of that. Harrison eventually sold his before World War II for about $80,000, and Preddy sold his after World War II for about $150,000. So they made money on those investments. But again, they cooperated closely. Litton, Eitel and McCullough worked together. Litton helped iMac set up their vacuum tube shop and gave them castings of his lathe and the diagrams so they could make their own. And they freely exchanged technical information, but also commercial information about potential customers and what you might, how you might do business. And this reduced the risks for these two small tube-related businesses, kind of like Jobs and Wozniak working together with the local computer hobby shops to sell their stuff, and the Homebrew Computer Club. So in the Depression, we've got Federal Telegraph in the late 20s. Leonard Fuller that's Clark's grandfather. Where's Clark? There he is. And Chris's great-grandfather. Anyway, Leonard Fuller was the chief engineer at Federal Telegraph in the late 20s. But he was the first PhD EE student from Stanford. But when the Depression came, Federal Telegraph was sold to the East Coast, and they had a leftover magnet in the yard rusting in Palo Alto. You can see it right here, the magnet and the pole piece. And at that point, Leonard Fuller was a professor at UC Berkeley and Dean of Engineering, and he talked to Ernest Lawrence, and said, gee, you got this cute little cyclotron. What could you do with a 42-inch magnet? Well, I could turn that into something pretty good. And so bringing up that 42-inch cyclotron enabled high-energy physics research and resulted in 6 Nobel Prizes by 1960 for UC Berkeley. And if you saw, I'm sure you saw the movie Oppenheimer. Here in the movie is this pole piece and the magnet. And here's Lawrence working on that. So U.S. Depression, 1936, Fred Terman asks Litton to come over to the campus and be a lecturer there and help in the labs to share his knowledge with the staff and students, because he has a lot of practical knowledge. He's invented a lot of things. And as part of those inventions, Sperry on the East Coast gave $1,000 to Litton for intellectual property on klystrons. And so Litton says, well, give it to Fred Terman. He'll know what to do with it. So Fred wrote to a student of his, Dave Packard, back on the East Coast. He had a job at General Electric. This is the Depression. You don't give a job easily. But he says, Dave, I've got $1,000, $500 for you and Lucille to live on for a year while you get your master's degree, and $500 for lab equipment. So Packard loaded his car up with Lucille and came over to Stanford and became a graduate student, where he met Bill Hewlett and Charlie Litton, and formed Hewlett-Packard in 1937. So here we see again this university-industry cooperation. The university helping the students, doing networking, helping them form businesses. Well, in the late 30s, there was a threat to peace, and Japan and Germany were rearming, and President Roosevelt knew he had to rebuild the Army and the Navy. And in Britain, there was a new system called radio detection and ranging, or radar, that they developed, which was kind of neat. You could take a radio signal, send it out, bounce it off something, and see it come back, and you say, oh, that's about 25 miles away. But it was what we call rather low frequency, and so it was rather imprecise. You could see there was something there, but you didn't know what it was. What they really needed was higher voltage and especially higher frequency transmitting tubes for this radar. And only IMAX tubes work best at those high voltages and frequencies they needed. So as we were entering World War II, IMAX tubes are in great demand. Then in 1937, Russell and Sigurd Varian, who were a couple of boys in Palo Alto, were worried about Germany, and they thought, I wonder if we could use microwaves to bounce off planes and see what they are and where they're located. So Russell Varian moved to Stanford's campus, worked with Bill Hansen in the physics lab. So he would come in with ideas. He was an idea guy, and he'd work on stuff, and he'd come in, and Bill would say, well, that won't work and that won't work, but try this and do this next. So they did this over about a 2-year period and came up with what I call an integrated circuit. It's cavities and things like that, little antennas, called a klystron. And they developed it using Litton's free advice, because he was a consultant there at Stanford, and Hansen's theoretical assistance. This is about a 30 kilowatt klystron here, and there they are, Russell and Sigurd. And probably only in Palo Alto will you see headlines like this. Well, this dictator down here says, let us alone, give us Czechoslovakia and we'll stop. Kind of echoes of today, I think. This guy over here, the president, says, we've got to rearm and everything. But the critical headline here is, new Stanford radio invention heralds revolutionary changes. And here we see Sigurd and Russell Varian in a description of this new microwave tube that makes a big difference in communications and in radar. So in the wartime, the Bay Area was expanding rapidly. It was a microwave hotbed, very progressive approach to business, very egalitarian within companies and between companies, like they shared. We talked about those before. And, but also egalitarian within the company. So very open policies typically, and fairly flat managerial structures. And this was great at thwarting unions during World War II, kept the employees happy and productive. For example, they started profit sharing. We had tuition reimbursement, so you could get your master's degree or bachelor's degree, and your company would pay for it if you got good grades. Open cafeterias so that people could come to work and build ships, build planes, without being interrupted and having to go home for lunch. Built medical clinics. Kaiser built medical clinics, which turned into Kaiser Permanente health plan that many of us have today. That all grew out of World War II and this wartime expansion. And we had the HP way philosophy of how companies should be strong community members, strong supporters of their employees, and strong supporters of their customers. And so we got very similar philosophies at Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild, Intel, Tandem Computers. I worked at Tandem Computers. We had a couple of interesting rules at Tandem. You learned these the first week. One of them was, if you're in a meeting and somebody comes up with a new idea, you can't say anything bad about it for 5 minutes. Typically, if you're in a meeting and you say, we could do this, some vice president's going to say, that's dumb. Well, you're not going to say anything again, right? Got shut down. We knew that new ideas came from, sometimes off the wall, but from people who were thinking about how the design was going, how the implementation was going, what it took to manufacture it. And this is where you got your new ideas from these entrepreneurs in the company. And so that was one of our rules. Another one was err on the side of the employee. If something goes wrong, you don't immediately say, it's Jim's fault, can him, get rid of him. No, it's what happened? What can we learn from this? How did this happen? Assume the employee was trying to do the right thing. So those are some of the things that were part of the culture of Silicon Valley. So RCA, since they coming out of the war, they decided to focus on television and broadcast. They formed the NBC network. And IMAC went on to develop a better line of high frequency and microwave tubes, mainly for hobbyists and hams. We all know some of those tubes. Well, the FCC decided to open up a new radio band called frequency modulation, or FM, which was supposed to be around 50 megahertz or so. It turned out to be 88 to 108. You're used to this on your dial. Unfortunately, RCA's tube wouldn't work at that frequency. So they did the next best thing. They copied the IMAC tube, which did work. I think you can see where this is going. So in 1947, IMAC sued RCA and GE and won a patent infringement lawsuit and shut down the manufacturer of those tubes by RCA and GE. So IMAC basically transformed them into the sales force for IMAC tubes. They could buy and resell them using their own name. So it might say RCA on the side, but it was probably made in San Carlos. So the big dog now was Silicon Valley, although we didn't call it then because we hadn't introduced silicon yet. So after the war, Charles Litton decided to pursue these high-power klystrons, and they worked it up from 30 kilowatts to 30 megawatts, and they used it for physics research, and they built the 2-mile linear accelerator out behind Stanford, and Stanford became quite a major player and developed into a number of Nobel Prizes and so on. And anybody today getting cancer treatment is using a Litton klystron. Here's another example of how things worked in Silicon Valley. Varian Associates. It wasn't Varian Corporation. It was kind of an egalitarian group of 6 or 8 people that wanted to start their own company and work together. So in 1948, Varian was selling microwave equipment, but they had some microwave measuring gear they had developed. And they told HP, for $20,000, we'll give you the design, and you can build them. That's what they didn't want to make them. So HP did. And this enabled HP to then expand their product line, which was developed into the Santa Rosa and Santa Clara divisions, and it became Agilent and then Keysight. So this is a mural up in Palo Alto, but it shows together some of the things that happened. You see Leonard Fuller here and Ernest Lawrence, and the big magnet that was given to UC Berkeley. Doc Herhold was our first regular broadcaster in San Jose, first in the nation. Lee DeForest has his Audion tube. Here's Charlie Litton with his lathe. And Fred Terman, thank you, talking to Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett. And Philo Farnsworth developed the all-electronic TV tube up in San Mateo. So this, you can see this mural yourself. It's up at Birch and Sheridan in Palo Alto. And you can see it's in an office. There's printers and computers and desks. But if you go up there during the week, you can walk into the office if you're quiet and take a look at that mural. So in the 1950s, here's another kid from Palo Alto, William Shockley, with his dog. He went to Caltech and then did his PhD at MIT and invented the transistor while at Bell Labs. And it was developed to replace, good point, to replace vacuum tubes. And he got the Nobel Prize in 1956 for, along with his partners, for developing the transistor. And so I think Silicon Valley should probably have been in New Jersey, which is where a lot of this technology developed at Bell Labs. But California, and especially our valley, was good at entrepreneurship and turning ideas into products. And I think that's what made the difference. So Bill Shockley left the East Coast. He didn't feel he was appreciated enough. And he returned to Caltech. And he taught there for a couple of years. And Arnold Beckman, who had quite a bit of money at that point, said, why don't you start a transistor company and we'll put it in Culver City in Los Angeles. And Shockley said, Culver City? I don't think so, because his mother was a graduate of Stanford and was still living here. So he came up to Palo Alto and he started Shockley Transistor in Mountain View in 1955, hired some really amazing people, Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, Jay Last, people like that. But he was really hard to work for. So the traitorous eight left him in 1957 to form Fairchild Semiconductor. Some of you may have worked at Fairchild, yeah, which had the first real venture capital funding. And at Fairchild, they developed the planar process. We needed that for diffused transistors because the MESA and other types of transistors were not reliable, but it required a special infrastructure. You had to have high vacuum technology. We've got that. Precision furnaces, yep, that's here. Be able to blow glass and machine quartz. We know how to do that. We've got machinists that can do that. Ultra pure gases and waters. We've got Hetchy water, very pure. And process control and continuous improvement. And that was all kind of a hallmark of these companies here in the Bay Area developing these new processes. And so when Bob Noyce and Jack Kilby invented the integrated circuit, Jean Hornet invented this planar process which would seal the junctions and make them quite reliable. And so obviously, since the transistors were made here, the integrated circuit was built on all these capabilities too, that developed in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to develop tubes. So it made sense for us to continue the technology development. And Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, said, maybe with a little exaggeration, he said, the planar process is the most important moment since man emerged as a life form. And probably a bit of an exaggeration, but I mean, you got 1 billion transistors in your pocket, a little computer that also makes phone calls. And so that and radio and all the technology has come together to form some pretty amazing results, including now artificial intelligence training with 100 GPU chips from NVIDIA. So at the end, in the 1960s, where I'm ending, the situation had changed dramatically. The peninsula was a big center now, a major electronics center, and it was the key player in the development of tubes, semiconductors, and integrated circuits. Half the microwave tubes were made on the peninsula. GE, for example, moved their microwave tube division to Palo Alto in the Stanford Industrial Park. They were in every advanced weapon system, in space systems, in a wide range of industrial goods. Some of you remember when they first came out with what Amana called the radar range, and nobody wanted one of those in their kitchen, so they called it a microwave oven instead. But that's what you get with good marketing. So Silicon Valley was the center of the defense effort for the country and also the US manufacturing economy. And why was that? Well, the East had very large vertically integrated firms, IBM and so on, that like to do things rather slowly, adjust to technology, sell lots of stuff. Good companies. Silicon Valley, on the other hand, was very fragmented, lots and lots of small companies. You read in the paper about the dozen or 15 big ones, but you don't read about the 2,000 little ones very often. And that's where the action is. So we have lots of specialized, very nimble, engineering-driven companies in software in different areas, and this dense regional network of small and medium-sized firms that support each other. So you've got law firms, Wilson Sonsini, you've got venture capital firms up on Sand Hill, and they all work together and draw from this common workforce because we've got enough people here, a critical mass of the right people. And in 1873, California's legislature passed a law saying non-compete clauses cannot be enforced in California. So if I join a company and I say, I won't work for a competitor for 1 year, and I leave, they can't enforce that. They can write it into the clause, write it into there, but the jury will, or the judge will throw it out. And so if I want to start a company, I can talk to my buddy at Google or at Sylvania or wherever, and if they join me, their company can't sue me. I can pull together a good team of people that want to work on my project. If I'm in Ohio or New York, I can't do that, or Boston, because the company may very well sue them saying, you promised you won't work for a competitor for a year. So that's a big advantage for California. There are only 5 states that have outlawed non-compete clauses. This lets us adapt very rapidly, and a lot of people thrive in that new environment. Not everybody, it's a challenge, but we have enough entrepreneurs and enough supporting engineers and managers and so on to make it work. So we've developed these practices and skills and competencies over about a 100-year period, starting in 1910, 1920. And we see it a lot in these communities of hobbyists, this collaboration and sharing. That's a key point, being able to collaborate together. And I covered the analog era and a little bit of the digital era, but then we get into software and biotech, mobile and phones, big data, virtual and augmented reality, self-driving vehicles, and now we're into artificial intelligence. And so we see this happening, all these new things, and most of them start here. As Gibbons says, the future is here now, it's just not widely distributed. And so we find that we see it first and then it gets distributed more broadly. But we have a large number of cutting-edge entrepreneurs who may have failed at something and they start something new. And then we have support from engineers and venture capitalists and many local universities. We've got Berkeley, San Jose State, Santa Clara, Stanford, that support this, that work with their employees, with their students and their graduates. And then we also see a lot of role models. The expectation here is you too, as a high school kid, can start your own website, become an influencer. These are the kinds of things our kids are used to seeing people do, and so we copy them. So it's a special culture of innovation that permeates Silicon Valley that makes it so successful. So in the 40s and 50s, we've got Shockley Semiconductor. So how many of you have an Apple iPhone? Let's see a show of hands. So the intelligent agent there is called Siri. Why is it called Siri? Well, because SRI is too hard to pronounce. So they added an I. This was a technology developed by several people at SRI, Stanford Research Institute up in Menlo Park. And they left to form their own company, and Apple bought them. And they just never renamed the product. So it's still called Siri. Hewlett-Packard I mentioned. Then in the 60s, we've got more semiconductor companies in addition to Fairchild. We've got Advanced Micro Devices, National Semiconductor, and Intel is formed. We've got a company called Applied Materials that does nothing but make equipment to make semiconductors. There's such a big market that that's actually a good market for them. In the 70s, we've got computer companies. We've got Apple Computer, which I talked about. I worked for Amdahl. Glenn worked at Amdahl. I worked at Tandem Computers. Quite a few computer companies. We've got Atari making video games. Who would have thought you could make money off of 25 cents per play? Yeah, did okay. Stanford and UC San Francisco have a patent on recombinant DNA, and over the years, the royalties on that have paid out $300 million. The first biotech company was Genentech, funded by about $250,000 in venture capital. So there's another startup that started a whole new industry. In the 80s, we have software. You could actually build software and sell it. So Adobe has this wonderful editing program for pictures on the Macintosh and then on Windows. Cisco develops Ethernet and then the internet, basically. We've got workstations, Silicon Graphics, Sun, MIPS. One of my favorites, of course, was Fry's Electronics, because we could go in there and buy disk drives and frames and power supplies and build our own computer. And then in the 90s, we've got a company called Tesla trying to make an electric vehicle. Good grief. Google starts up. We've got Facebook, social media. And then we've got all the artificial intelligence companies, XAI, OpenAI, Perplexity, Anthropic, coming up over the last 3 to 5 years. NVIDIA, now worth, what, $3 trillion, making the processors needed to train artificial intelligence. We have software as a service, Salesforce, Pandora, Netflix, streaming video. So it's really changing. And a lot of companies find they have to move here. I mentioned that General Electric moved here in the 1950s because they needed to find microwave engineers, and they couldn't hire them to move back to New York, so they started their company out here, their microwave division. Ford has about 300 engineers up on the Stanford Industrial Park. General Motors has Cruise Automation, which did a lot of their software. Toyota has invested and is investing about $1 billion, of which about $100 million is around MIT and Boston, but the other $900 million is around Stanford. So that's funds flooding in here. Samsung is a Korean company, and they need to buy technology. So they have the software and systems for building washing machines, kitchen stuff, cars, all kinds of stuff that Samsung builds, robots. And so they buy your little company and they say, how would you like to move to Seoul, Korea? And you say, I don't think so. And so they built a 10-story office building over here in Santa Clara. And they say, okay, you're going to be on the second floor in the south wing, all 9 of you. And we bought this company, and they're going to be on the 4th floor in the west wing, all 17 of you. And they've got this bubbling cauldron of technology over in Santa Clara. And that's the Samsung development area. And where is Silicon Valley? Well, it's, yeah, if you look on a map, you might see it labeled. It's up in this area where we are. But really, it's a metaphysical space. Now it's, if I'm Uber or Lyft, they say, yep, that's a Santa Clara Valley, that's a Silicon Valley company. And both of them, of course, are in San Francisco, not Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is just too small to handle it all. So we go from Santa Cruz and Scotts Valley through this area to Berkeley, maybe up to Livermore, perhaps to Sacramento someday. So it's a big area. So how different is Silicon Valley? Well, we say it's our attitude in Silicon Valley. Failure is a feature, not a bug. So if something fails, there's a message there for you, or it's a feature. We don't call it a bug, we fix it maybe. One of the mottos of one of the companies early on was, move fast, break things. Get it out quick. If it doesn't work, we'll fix it in the field. So that's, we won't mention the company. And in Star Wars, Yoda says, do or do not. There is no try. And so there's this full commitment by these entrepreneurs and the engineers and people working with them to make it work. Work hard, maybe it's 80, 90-hour work weeks, but there's a full commitment to make your product succeed. And maybe in Silicon Valley, 80% of companies fail. Across the nation, it's about 90%. But that's not too bad for here. So you may very well, your buyout may be you're bought by Microsoft, that may be your big payday, or maybe an initial public offering, and your stock now is worth millions of dollars. But if Microsoft buys you for 3 or 4 billion, that's not too bad. So there's a good book on this called Making Silicon Valley, where they talk about those early days. And Annalise Aksanian up at UC Berkeley has a book where she compares Silicon Valley to Boston's Route 128, which at one point they thought either one could be the leader, but it quickly leaned toward our area and not Boston. Margaret Amara up at University of Washington compares Stanford and the area around it to the University of Pennsylvania and its environs, and then Georgia Tech and the Atlanta area, and compares and contrasts and shows why this area has so many advantages. Another good book is Decoding Silicon Valley, how it works here, how other places can maybe duplicate some of what we do. And so a quick review, I mentioned competition and cooperation. That's pretty typical here. We're not silos. We're a lot of little companies working together, as Eitel and McCullough worked with Litton. It's often hobby focused. We mentioned the Homebrew Computer Club. A lot of people today in high school or in college work together with their buddies to start some new piece of software or a new web design or implementation company. And we have lots of small, dynamic companies. You read about the big ones, but it's a lot of the small ones where the action is happening. And I mentioned the California framework, legal framework, which is very favorable to starting up companies, recycling goods and products and so on into new companies. And so there's a lot of turnover, a lot of turmoil. It's very dynamic, but it works very well for starting up and successful companies. Our great universities who are willing to work with the graduate students and the grads, the alumni, and a large and growing pool of entrepreneurs and technologists. I advise people graduating from Purdue or Ohio State, if you get a job if you're interested, in the Silicon Valley area, at least for 2 or 3 years, you'll get this in your blood. And then you can go elsewhere and bring your ideas there and start up, but you might want to come here first. So very often, this area gets the cream of the crop of graduates in the United States and internationally that come here because this is where a lot of the action is. And if you want to be on that leading edge, this is where you want to be. It's a great place to live and raise a family, if you can afford it. You can't afford a house unless you know somebody. But so that's a difficult thing. The valley is surrounded by hills. There's limited space, hard to get permits, hard to build. So that's a real challenge. So hopefully over the next couple of years, we'll get enough apartments and houses built to help more of these companies succeed. But the big companies, it makes more sense for them, like Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, to move to Texas, keep their development here, but have a lot of stuff in some other state because this is an expensive area to operate in. Hewlett-Packard developed that many years ago in the 60s and 70s. Every time they get up to about 10,000 people, or 20,000, they would break it off into another division in Oregon or Roseville or different places and in Colorado. So that worked well for what they were doing. They could divisionalize and productize. So that's another option. So that gives you a pretty good idea of where Silicon Valley came from. I'm not going to cover any more, but if you worked here, might want to tell us what you did. what questions you might have or that I could expand on. But you've got a handout. You can download the slides if you want. This edited video, will be on the Saratoga Historical Foundation website probably in a couple of weeks. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll take questions.
Question, anyone?
Talked a lot about radios, and I've heard, but I've never confirmed, that the first radio station in the country was in San Jose. Is that true, or do you know?
Oh, that's better. Oh, it's one at a time, I guess. So Doc Herhold started doing broadcasts for his students. He had a school on radio, and he, by 1912, he was broadcasting regularly Wednesday night. He called his program San Jose Calling, and he was the very first regularly scheduled broadcast operator in the United States. His wife would go to the local record store and bring records home, new records that were out, and play them. So she was the first disc jockey. So that is true. This was AM radio. He started out in ARC radio, but then it became a radio station FN and eventually KCBS. So KCBS is the one that resulted from Doc Herhold's operation in San Jose. Good question. Yes, go ahead.
So I first heard about an individual named Perham when I learned about the equipment that they helped preserve, and for a while there was a museum at Foothill College for several years. Can you talk about the role of Perham in the early history?
Yeah, the Perham Foundation, I showed his house in here in Palo Alto. And at one point, the Perham Foundation was able to use what became the Foothill College planetarium. And they had quite a bit of the stuff from the 1920s. He saved a lot of the radio equipment from those days and technology, and that became the collection. It was down around down in South San Jose in the hills for a long time, and they put it in the Foothill College area, and then eventually Foothill kicked them out, and so it got put in a warehouse, and now it's at History San Jose down there, and you can see parts of it. I've taken pictures down there. They have some of them at some of those things. Another little piece of technology came down. I gave this talk, and Clark Canham said, "That's my grandfather there. He left me a box of stuff back in the 60s when he was a kid." So he brought that box in, and I looked, and that's where we got that Audion tube, which his grandfather had saved. There were two of them there, as well as a couple of big Westinghouse rectifiers and some other odds and ends. But the Perham collection now is at History San Jose. More technician than engineer. But he ran the lab, as I understand it. Go ahead.
Hi. We all know that Mr. Shockley was less than a benevolent employer. How do you think the Valley would have been if Mr. Shockley was a wonderful boss and everybody loved working for him?
That's a tough one. If he had, the difficulty was not only that he was rather autocratic, but he was also mercurial. He would go from one project to another. So he'd have his people working on the junction transistor, and he'd say, "Oh, the 4-layer diode, that's the next new thing. Let's work on that." So they weren't able to complete things. They were very frustrated. And Bob Noyce especially pulled the people together to talk about that. So if he'd been a good manager, Fairchild might very well have taken off as one of the key ones. If he was really good, he would have stayed at Bell Labs. But he felt that they didn't appreciate him enough, and he left in a bit of a huff and went back to Caltech. And so I think his personality really helped Silicon Valley, because we got him and he started, as I say, a stone's throw from Palo Alto in Mountain View, just up there. And if you go up to what used to be the old Sears building on San Antonio Road, thank you, you'll see these great big monstrous, they're transistors. There's a circuit drawn there. One's a 4-layer diode and one's a transistor. Commemorating those developments of Fairchild and Shockley.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for this presentation. It really brought back some very good memories.
You're a software engineer.
Yeah, I worked in a lot of the companies that you showed logos for. So my question is, this place is called Silicon Valley. So why is it called Silicon? Why is the emphasis on semiconductor versus the tubes?
Yeah. So we were making all this stuff with silicon transistors and then integrated circuits. And in 1971, an editor, a writer, wrote an article, and he called it Silicon Valley. And the name kind of stuck. So it started in 1971 with an article. And people that are involved in disk drives, which was also a Silicon Valley thing, thought, let's call it Storage Valley. Never took off. And then photonics came along with fiber optics. They says, let's call it Photonics Valley. We haven't been able to purge it. We make very few silicon parts anymore, but it's still called Silicon Valley because it's the heritage. It started in 1971. How are we doing? We've got plenty of time.
Thank you. I wanted to ask your impression of a big East Coast technology company that moved west and tried to soak up some of the Silicon Valley ethos, and that was Xerox PARC, which really
wonderful.
did, become one of those legendary institutions, but was kind of burdened by maybe the East Coast thinking because of where it came from and never really commercialized anything very well. But love to hear your thoughts on how they fit into the presentation you gave.
Xerox PARC was a key technology developer in Palo Alto. It was started by Xerox company, which of course made copiers. So they wanted more technology that would help them make copies better, or maybe office stuff. And Xerox PARC developed, working with SRI, off SRI, developed some amazing systems. I helped bring up a Xerox, what was the first computer? Not the Alpha, it's called Alta, the Alta computer. Anyway, it had a vertical screen. It was you could use any font on it. It had its own fonts, its own operating system, its own word processor. It was a pretty big cabinet of electronics. And they probably made a number of hundreds of these things, which would have been great in an office. So Xerox could have taken that technology and gone up against the IBM Selectric and their MTST systems. But they didn't. They didn't see that writing on the wall. And between what Xerox did and the mother of all demos from SRI, Steve Jobs saw that and said, whoa, I love fonts, and this is great. And there's this thing called, you call that a mouse? And you've got this networking. You can go from computers to buildings and so on. So that's what became the Macintosh. And Xerox PARC sprang out lots and lots of technology, the George Pake era up there. And so probably some of you worked at Xerox PARC. How many spent some years there? A little bit. So, okay. technology out of there. Ethernet came out of Stanford and Xerox PARC. The internet was highly influenced there. So TCP/IP was developed by, my mind went blank. Anyway, yep, well they developed the base stations for it, yep. So anyway, Xerox PARC was a key contributor of technology that sprang off many companies around here. Communications, probably Roam, and so on. Good recollection. I've got about 3 hours more of stories, but I'm not going to go into them. Other questions?
So I just wanted to reinforce what you were saying about the sort of the ethos. For me, after working for a bunch of startups, it's like there's no stigma to failure. In other words, you know, if you fail at something, you just find a couple other people you're working with. The company went down the toilet. You go over with those people because they're doing something interesting over there. So there's no, you know, there's nothing bad that happens from failing, essentially. And there's no stigma to trying and failing. I think that's a West Coast or that's a Silicon Valley thing. That's not an East Coast thing at all.
We use it as a learning opportunity. What we say is that if you failed, we want you on our team because you know a lot of stuff that can help us avoid failure. So you may be in a couple of failures and then be in a successful startup. So it's not so much a stigma. If I run a project, I'll pick on IBM, at IBM or GE, and it fails, I probably go into continuing engineering or become the janitor. I don't get on the next project because I had a failed project. But out here, people want you on their next project. It's more typical. Yes?
Thank you. So when companies go, like any probably technical company is going old, when it is growing in size, it is common sense that this company is becoming more bureaucratic, slowly turning, sometimes even like losing its initial motives. Did you saw some companies that were successfully resisting these changes for decades, for example, and maybe somebody even was capable of turning back?
Talking about company life cycle and how you Paul?
Okay.
About company life cycle and avoiding.
Well, one of the stories about Boston and Route 128 is Digital Equipment Corporation. And Digital Equipment Corporation wanted to be like IBM. And they wanted to make their computers, their VAX, their 1170s and so on, and the disk drives, and the tape drives, and the operating system, and the memory, and the installation, and the service, and everything. The difficulty in having a system like that is if you want to upgrade your computers, you may have to also upgrade everything else. You're dragging all this vintage stuff along with you. And so at many of these companies, they find they want to go slowly because they have to milk what they've got. They've got to have a new product, but they have to let it set and work while they get the other pieces together. The upgraded operating system, the new disk drives, the new tape drives. I tell the story of IBM. IBM in San Jose was making disk drives, and they were the size of a dishwasher, and they stored 30 megabytes, and on this 11-high disk stack. And so they were making them there, and they have heads that go in and out, and they're hydraulic. So you turn the oil on, and it goes in, and you turn it off, and it goes on the track, and it reads the data. So, but the people who bought these things had oil on the floor of their computer room because they would leak. Kind of unsightly, and you might slip on it. But they made tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of these disk drives. So a group down at IBM in San Jose decided they had a better idea. Let's use a magnet and a voice coil, like a speaker, but with a long throw, to move these heads in and out among the disks. And they says, we can make this thing, look, here's one in the lab. And IBM said, that's great. Wait a couple of years. You don't realize most of our disk strings are out on lease. And if we come out with this new one, those are all coming back. We'll have warehouses full of stuff. So just wait a couple of years. Well, in Silicon Valley, you don't have to wait. So Stan Brown and those guys came and formed a new company called Information Storage Systems, where I worked. And they made this disk drive, nice and fast. And they minted money. Our vice president told us anybody who flies more than 2 hours goes first class. He says, my rear end gets just as, the janitor's rear end gets just as hard as mine does. So we made a lot of money off the fact that IBM cannot move very fast in their technology. Those are a couple of stories about how large companies have a difficult time keeping up in technology. Do you have a follow-up or another question? If not, I think we can dismiss. If you have additional discussions, come on up and join me. Thank you. Thank you. As I said, we hope to have a video up on the Saratoga history website in a couple of weeks.
One of the problems is because of having to report quarterly